Hey folks, welcome back. We are talking about an exploration of your wisdom zone, working with flow rather than force. So, what is your relationship with flow versus force when life transitions hit? Today's guest, Marie Elizabeth Molly, is a mentor and brain trainer for high achieving women, and she specializes in, yes, you guessed it, flow. And you can read all about her in the show notes. But Marie Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Karen. It's so good to be here.
I am excited about this conversation. Let's dive right in. You work with women going through various transitions like divorce, and you do this thing with flow versus push or force. What does that mean?
Well, it's so tempting when things get rough. We want to grind our way through it. We strategize, we push, we work hard, we make things happen through force of will. I think that's also very cultural in the West. We're taught to go for things out of willpower and push. And the fact is that often what our conscious minds want us to push toward is not necessarily what's most aligned, to use a jargony word, and we can unpack the word aligned if you want, but it's not always what's most aligned with our heart. And deeper inside than the mind, for some of us, we feel it more in the heart. Some of us have a gut knowing. Wherever you access it inside, there is a deeper wisdom that is more connected to our truth, to our deeper self, to our wisdom, to our soul. I know for some people these are woo out there words, but to translate it, it's the difference between what you were taught to want, how you were taught to do things, versus what's actually more native to you or maybe more true for you in this moment. And so learning to find flow has a lot to do with learning to listen to yourself more deeply, to handle your reactive mind, that surface mind that's just like kill or be killed, especially in a high conflict situation, as a lot of your listeners face. The mind goes toward kill or be killed, but there's often a deeper wisdom that can see the situation a little more holistically and has a better outcome or a better way to approach it.
Yes, unfortunately, I really resonate with that force push piece a lot. And in fact, you and I were chatting offline previously, and in a business accelerator to grow my business. And of course, as you know, growing one's business involves a lot of trial and error. Did I mention error and error and error? And
I'm familiar with the concept.
and patience and patience. And so, as a type A driver personality, I force and I push, and I keep thinking, with all of my skill and all of my knowledge and what have you, why is this not working? And I want to talk about it in the context, of course, for my audience, high conflict divorce, but I wanted to share with the listener as well that this is an ongoing struggle for me. And it makes sense that in the divorce transition, whether it's out of fear or determination or need to control, that same push, that same force seems to be our first go-to. And can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit and
And
elaborate a little bit on what is the downside of that? Because
it,
consciously it seems like, okay, I know what I want. Let me just drive toward it.
yes, I love how you put that, because the upside is that we generate a lot of energy, focus, direction, commitment, determination. All of that gets generated through being type A people who tend to push toward things. I mean, the reason I teach about this is because I had to learn it. I too am a type A, grown up in New York, go get it type of girl.
Yep.
And I too have hit these roadblocks where it's like, why is this not working? I'm working so hard. The downside is that when you are trying to make things happen from an activated nervous system, from a nervous system that is locked in fight or flight, that is locked in kill or be killed, as I like to say, you're not thinking rationally. It's like an instinct takes over and you just act, and you have to act and make things happen. And when we can slow down and actually recalibrate our nervous system to a more parasympathetic or a more resourceful and well-resourced place, that's where true creativity arises. The thing is, creativity has a really hard time bubbling up when we're in push mode, when we're in force mode, when we're in I gotta make this happen or else mode. All we see, it's like a horse with the blinders on. All we see is this one road. But often the better approach is a creative one that you don't see till you take off the blinders. And the only way you can take off the blinders is by actually addressing what's happening on the level of the nervous system. And when we get into a more expansive place, that's where new ideas can come up, and we can actually be more, what I'd like to call, calibrated to the situation. Yes, there's times to push, but there's also times to lean back. And we can't discern the difference until we can get out of push mode and into flow mode.
Yeah, so I totally get the fight or flight, the whole being in the reptilian brain, not having access to your prefrontal cortex. That part I understand. Can you elaborate a little bit on, and I think that what I'm thinking when you say creativity, one of the things we talk to our clients about is you can't see choice when you're in fight and flight. You can't even see it. So I think that for me, when you say creativity, I also think choice. And if I take my
Yes,
blinders off, then maybe there are a couple of side paths that would serve me well that I'm not even looking at because I'm getting from point A to point B. Am I on the right track here?
you are 100% on the right track. That's what I'm talking about.
So let's unpack this flow piece and what comes before flow, because I'm getting the sense that first I regulate and then I at least have the possibility of entering the neighborhood of flow and leaving the neighborhood of force.
Yes, I like to follow the model that was developed by Stephen Kotler, who wrote this great book called The Rise of Superman, which is all about the 4 stages of flow. And he's written many other books, all of which are really good. He's a great writer, highly recommend. The Art of Impossible is another one that I love. But what Stephen talks about is the first stage of flow is actually what he calls the struggle phase. This is when you're doing your research. This is when you're brainstorming. This is when you're hashing out the ideas. You're not in flow yet, but this is what sets you up to be able to get into flow. So struggle is actually a necessary part of flow. So there might be some push in the struggle phase. For an athlete, it's when they're training. Flow ideally is when they're competing, but in the training period where you're pushing your muscles to get stronger, you're trying to up your speed, things like that, that's all the struggle phase. That's the first phase of flow. The second phase is called release, and this phase is key. And I'm going to use an example, let's say from business, because we've touched on business. You might be trying to create a new offer or a piece of marketing or some copy or something like that, and you're struggling and you're researching, you're trying to find the words, you're trying to write the thing. The next phase, what you got to do is you have to put it down. And you put it down by going to take a walk, or you go and take a shower or a nap or have a meal, and you step away from the topic that you're struggling with, which allows the work to transfer from your conscious mind that's been trying to create the thing back into your subconscious mind. So even though you're out there doing something else that feels good, maybe you take the dogs for a walk, that's a really good one. Your subconscious mind is still noodling on the thing, but your conscious mind gets to rest and you get to step away from it. This stage is what then sets you up to be able to enter flow. So you come back, and the next stage that emerges is flow. So very often while you're walking the dogs or you're in the shower, you're having your meal, a brilliant idea pops in your head out of nowhere,
Right,
right?
right.
We like to say, oh, it came out of nowhere. No, it didn't come out of
Yes.
nowhere. It came out of the struggle and the release. And you let that shit go. And then your subconscious could work on it. And then it lobbed the answer or the great idea up to your conscious awareness. And then from there, that's when you can hit flow. So you have this new idea, then you can take it and run with it. The fourth stage, and for most people, let me say about flow, for most people, they're able to sustain flow for up to about 90 minutes. It's a very expensive state. It uses a lot of brain chemicals. So when you're in, and again, I'm going to come back to the writing example, when you're creating something, you're writing something, the ideas are flowing, it's moving really well. And at some point your brain dies. Like it dries up. Like that means flow has ended and it's now time to enter the fourth stage, which is recovery. This is when you go do something nice for yourself. You might take a nap, you might take a bath, you might go walk the dogs, you might have dinner. Whatever it is you do, if you're an athlete, this is when you step the meet, the game is over, or the meet or the match, whatever you play. And this is when you do your recovery. You stretch out. You might do an ice bath. You might do heating pads. You might, whatever you need to do to recover. You might get a massage. As a creator, also, you might want to get a massage. You might want to just do some little bit of pampering and sleep so that you're ready to start the cycle again. And so then the next phase of the cycle, you go back into struggle. You start, well, what is the next thing I'm working on? So in the context of a divorce, what I would say, let's say I'm going to take a mediation meeting, for example. So you might be struggling, trying to figure out, like, what do I want to ask for? What's important to me? What am I willing to release, to let go of? And what is a non-negotiable for me, etc. That's the struggle phase, is getting clear on all that stuff. Then you release it and you go relax. Then do something nice. Then you enter the meeting, and ideally in the meeting, you can be in flow because you're clear about what you want. You're clear about your non-negotiables. You're clear about what you can be flexible with. You're more resourceful in your nervous system, so you can actually listen to what's being said to you rather than immediately going into attack. All of that I count as flow. And then after the mediation session, that's when you want to do something nice for yourself and relax, tend to yourself, do things that feel good, that settle your system, etc. You can use this cycle in so many ways.
I love this. And so it's interesting because I was going to ask you, so how does this relate? Because at first you were talking almost like on a project level, but as we know, whether you are transitioning your career or a divorce or whatever, it's a season. And my listener may be in that season for 6 months to my longest is 10 years so far. So if I hear you correctly, there is a way in which you can, within that lengthy season, that you have almost phases. So I'm thinking, as you're talking, I'm thinking one of the things we talk about is the early stages where you're dealing with your head, your heart, and your home. You're not hiring an attorney yet. You're not doing any of that, but it's like, am I clear on my decision? Do I definitely want to do it? Or so was I told that they want to? What do I want to change in my living arrangements, and new rules and boundaries in the house? And how do I tell my spouse if I have to tell? And how do we tell the children? And what do I need to learn in terms of my legal rights? So these are just a couple.
Yes.
So for me, as I'm thinking about if we could take this concept and attach push versus flow to it, I think that would be really valuable for the listener.
You've heard the saying, April showers bring May flowers. If co-parenting has been difficult this year due to your ex's alcohol abuse, you need SoberLink. How it works is simple. Your co-parent will test at scheduled times. Built-in facial recognition will confirm their identity. Tamper sensors will flag any attempts to cheat, and results will get sent instantly to your phone, so you know that your kids are with a sober parent. Lay the groundwork for brighter days ahead. Visit soberlink.com/JBD to learn more and get $50 off your device. Divorce is like a foreign land, filled with unfamiliar rules and jargon, and pressure to make complex decisions that will impact the rest of your life. Don't go it alone. Go to rapidreliefcall.com and get the support and guidance you need.
So the first stage is that struggle phase of trying to hash it out in your head. Then you make sure when you kind of hit an impasse or you're tired, make sure to go walk away from it, take a break. That's when you walk the dogs, have a meal, take a shower, take a spin class, whatever clears your head. You want to clear your head. Let your truth bubble up to the surface. Oh yeah, this is what I want. I want the kids these days, whatever. I just heard about somebody really interesting. This is a total aside, but I just heard it yesterday, so I'm sharing it. Rather than the kid moving back and forth between their two houses, the parents actually switched houses.
We call that
so the
nesting.
kid, yeah.
Yes.
And she described it's so great because her aging parents live near where her husband and kid live, or ex-husband and kid live. So she's able to both be with her kid and see her aging, check in on her parents because of this brilliant arrangement. Anyway, it's not one that I would have thought of natively.
Yeah.
So,
So you're describing the concept of nesting, which
yes.
has become very popular over the last few years for some people and less so for others. So
Right.
would it be fair to say that even in my early stage description, let's say we say getting clear on the decision, how to tell, what to do in terms of sleeping and living arrangements, boundaries in the house, and then telling the children, and then temporary shared parenting. So there's 5 parts to this stage. And would you say, and I'm hearing you, struggle, release, flow, recover. So I'm hearing almost like engage in what you're dealing with, which is that struggle. Am I ready? Do I really want to do this? What's my fear? Like, what else do I need to know to be certain? That's the struggle. And then give yourself a break. Just get out of Dodge, walk away, relax, release, and then you're re-engaging. But the re-engagement is actually taking everything you thought of, which will obviously include regulating your nervous system and addressing the anxiety and the fear and the monkey mind stories, right? And so then when you come back, you've got, this is my plan of action, let's say for just telling my spouse, and now I'm in flow, and that helps me creatively figure out and engage in the conversation.
Exactly. So the flow part in this example would be the actual conversation. And then you want to recover after the conversation. You want to tend to yourself, grieve if need be, whatever is coming up, be with it. I want to say a word about the conversation. I was a relationship coach for years, and what I found really helpful, especially when navigating charged conversations, was to set them up in a particular way. And the first is to open the conversation by saying something along the lines of, hey, I've got something vulnerable to share with you, or I've got something chargy to share with you, or I've got something intense, scary, whatever the proper word for your actual state is. I've got something vulnerable to share with you. Is this a good time? Because many of us, when we have stuff to share, we just launch into it, especially if we're go-getters. We just launch into it without regard for whether the other person is actually available. And my habitual go-to that never works is often when my husband is doing something else, like driving or cooking. And he's a person who doesn't split attention very well. And what we've learned is it works so much better to say, hey, I've got something blank to share with you. Is this a good time?
Love that.
And then the person can either say, yes, they have the bandwidth, they're available mentally, focus-wise to be with you. They might say yes, they might say, not sure, not yet. And then the next thing is, or they say no, And then you can say, great, when might be a good time, right? So that you agree on a time when both of you are going to be present. That is so key, especially when you're discussing dodgy stuff that can go sideways.
Absolutely.
So that's step one. Step two is to frame what the desired result is of the conversation before you start the conversation. Because if you do it in this way, if the conversation starts going sideways, you have a great way to bring it back. What this sounds like is, I'm bringing this up today because I want us to get to an agreement around XYZ, make a specific thing, or I want us to get to this place. I want to feel safe to talk to you. It doesn't have to be like a destination of a thing achieved. It can just be like, I'm bringing this up because I want to feel safe to talk with you again, and it's felt difficult lately. Would you be on board with figuring out how to create a safe environment for us both to express? That can be the destination. But it can also be like, hey, I want to work out who's going to get the silverware. Are you willing? Right? That was a fight that we had. So that's why that came to mind. But in my divorce, my first husband. Anyway, so that's the second piece, is to set up and be clear about where you want to get to with this conversation, so that if you suddenly start arguing about something else, you can say, hey, I get that this is really an important thing, and today's conversation is about this, and this is where we're going. I'd love to come back to that. Is that okay? Right? So it gives you the license to come back to the thing at hand. And then the step three is to state like the opening thing you want to say as cleanly and simply as possible, neutral, flat, without a lot of explanation. Because what happens often when we're nervous and we're bringing up stuff that's chargy, that's hard, is we tend to over-explain and pad it and go, well, this, and I've thought of the 15 ways why this matters. And we tend to do a lot of that. And what happens when we do that is the listener has a really hard time knowing what to focus on.
Yeah.
And they will get reactive, or they'll tune out, because it's this barrage of words, and it's like a computer that has too much input. It starts buffering. So the listener starts buffering, and then the speaker gets frustrated because you can see the listener is buffering, and you're like, you never listen to me. And then you're off and running with the fight you've had 100 times over the last 15 years, right? So those are some really key steps to be able to have a conversation in that flows.
Right. Yeah. And so what I hear you saying is in that struggle piece, it's like, okay, I've decided that I want to get a divorce. I need to tell my spouse, what do I want to say? And this is what I work with people on. What do I want to say? What don't I want to say? How do I want to say it? Right? Keep it in the eye, keep it brief, as you're saying. So the flow stage is you've made these decisions, you know what you're saying, you know where you're not going. And to your point, you're giving them some scaffolding, some sense of what this is about. And I totally agree with either schedule it or at least ask permission for now. You don't want to be swiping someone. So all of this, so now you're in the conversation and you can actually flow because you've thought it through, you've released, you've come back, you've had the conversation, even a hard conversation, because your creativity is up there, hopefully your nervous system is calmed down a little bit. And that will feel, and I think for the listener, it will feel different. It will feel different than conversations or arguments you've had before. This particular conversation, my 2 cents is this is less of a conversation and more of a sharing of a decision, especially with our high conflict people. So this is not, tell me what you think and maybe you can talk me out of it. This is really,
100%.
I've made a decision, and do you have a few minutes? Is this a good time? And then you keep it in the eye. And I don't want to get too far aside, because that is the flow. And then what I'm hearing you say is, now you've done this thing, you've accomplished this thing, you've been in some level of flow, go and take care of yourself. Some self-care.
You're probably tired, right? And you're probably like emotionally wrung out.
Right.
And that's not the time to start packing up your house.
Right.
That's the time. It's just not.
Right.
That's the time to go take a bath and eat some chocolate, like whatever your go-to comforting things are. That's the time to do that so that you give your system a chance
So,
to recover.
this is so neat because it's simple, right? Struggle, release, flow, recovery, that you can chunk down every conversation you need to have with your spouse or soon to be ex, every stage of divorce. And if you were to do this, if you were to say, okay, I'm in stage one, I'm in the struggle, what do I want? How shared parenting, right? Oh my God, I don't want him to have any of the time. I'm the stay-at-home mom. He doesn't deserve it. He never does it. He can't do it well anyway, right? This whole thing. You work through all of that and struggle. Well, that's not going to work. What can I be flexible on? You release, you walk away, you come back and you have the conversation. Some of these conversations you'll have many times. You may flow less in the first one than you do in the second or third or fourth one.
Yes.
But I love
totally.
this. I love this as like a scaffolding for every conversation and every big next step throughout the entire process.
It's really, I agree. It's a great scaffolding for any kind of, you can apply it to cleaning out your house.
Yeah.
You can apply it to anything really.
Talking to your
And
teenager.
exactly. It has so many applications, both professionally and personally. And the key, a couple of keys that make this cycle so important and effective is to remember that struggle is a part of it. I think for a lot of us who are used to, going for things and being clear, etc., like we tend to see struggle as a bad thing.
And
Or that,
avoid it as
and
opposed to
avoid
have
it.
full permission to just be in it.
Right. Just be in it because, oh, I'm in the first stage of flow. Of course I'm not clear. Like it normalizes the lack of clarity that we sometimes feel, especially around big, important stuff that's close to our hearts.
Right.
And it can be confusing. It can make us cuckoo for a while. So being able to normalize that and recognize, oh, I'm in the struggle stage. It takes that layer of self-recrimination that we often add on top of the struggle, that then gets us stuck.
Right.
It takes that off.
Right.
So struggle becomes normalized, and then we learn to put it down, to allow the brilliant, correct next step to bubble up, act on that step, recover. It's just a much more self-honoring and sane way to approach things, I think.
Beautiful, beautiful. And explain the wisdom zone to us. Explain, how does it all get connected now?
Yeah, so the wisdom zone is what I call that deeper inner knowing that is able to be accessed when we're not hijacked by fight or flight, by our nervous system, by being activated. Because my deep fundamental belief is that we do know, even that when it feels like we don't, we do, that there is some part of us that has an idea about what's best for us. And it's not always our conscious mind, because our conscious mind has been very well trained by our family, religion, culture, society, schooling, to think in certain very predetermined tracks. And for many people, at least many of the people that I work with, and for myself, I'm just not that conventional a person. So what I was taught to want and believe didn't totally fit. And I tried to do it the right way. And then I found that wasn't really me. And I had to go deeper and discover what is that me that is underneath all the conditioned ways of responding to life. And that is what I call the wisdom zone. And it requires slowing down a bit, having permission for all of ourselves to exist. And what I mean by that is many of us have also learned to really privilege, myself included, have all really learned to privilege the most societally approved of and venerated aspects of ourselves. In my case, I grew up in this hyper intellectual environment. I went to some of the best schools. I basically learned that my head is king, well, queen. My head is where all the brilliance lies, and my body is sort of this. I mean, I was a dancer, so I was somewhat embodied. However, I really learned to lead with my intellect, to lead with my smarts, to lead with my father really valued critical thinking. And so I had to really learn how to construct a valid argument, all of that stuff. And all of that was at the expense of this kind of softer, more intuitive, more flowing, let's say more water-like part of me that I really had to learn to develop more of as an adult, because the bull in the china shop aspect of me was creating wreckage. So what I call the wisdom zone is really this access to our deeper truth. It's another way of saying that. And that can take some excavation. Maybe not everybody's used to self-reflection in this way. Some of us, I happen to have started meditating very young. So self-reflection comes naturally to me because I've been a meditator for, I don't know, over 40 years. But for folks who have never looked inside, or who have only looked inside in a way that's defined by therapy, right? So only looked inside to look at what's wrong and why is it that way and who made it that way and what did our parents do, who've like what I'm talking about is different. That's an important part of the journey. I think therapy is really useful, and it's not the whole picture. Because we can get hyper focused on things that we feel are wrong with us that we need to fix,
Right.
which then also prevents us from accessing our wisdom because we're constantly focusing on fixing stuff.
And I think that's where I want to jump in, because one of the challenges when you're emerging from a high conflict marriage is you have been criticized to the point where you believe it all. So it's
And
like whether you
gaslit.
want to call it brainwashing, manipulation, belittling,
Yep.
berating. And so
Yes.
I personally, when I was trying to decide whether or not to divorce, I was such a broken, diminished, shrunken version of myself. And so
Yeah.
my experience is that when my inner critic
Yeah.
is screaming through the amplifier, my sweet little intuitive, connected to God or the universe, it's so quiet. Like I couldn't hear it. And so what do you, when you work with people, what is that work that you do to quiet the inner critic so that we can begin to amplify that really powerful intuitive connection?
Yeah. Oh, I love this question because I too have a hefty inner critic. And I'll tell you a story which will show how I work with this. When I was in, well, my second graduate school program, which was an MFA in poetry at Sarah Lawrence, I got so in my second semester, I had a professor who I really admired who actually helped me get in the program. And I was completely crippled by my inner critic. We had to write a poem a week, bring it to class for a workshop, and I couldn't write a word. And so I would bring in something terrible and it was embarrassing. And I never want to have an experience like that again. So what I did, I realized, oh, my inner critic is going to town. Like it's not even letting me write my first draft. I went inside and I started a conversation. And this is what I suggest people do is we often, with what I call our more inconvenient bits, as I like to call them, we resist them. We want to suppress them. We want to cut them off. We want to shut them up. We want to kill them because they're messing up our lives. In contrast, I like to approach these inconvenient bits with curiosity. So I went to my inner critic with curiosity because I come from a baseline belief that every part of us wants the best for us. It's just expressing it often in a messed up way. So like so I had this conversation with my inner critic, and it's like, well, I'm trying to have you be good. I'm trying to have you be better. I want your writing to be better. And I'm like, yeah, but you're choking me. I can't write. So we developed an agreement, because it was a whole conversation. And I do this kind of work with clients. It's called parts work in therapy. It's called parts work. It's called voice dialogue. There's many names for it. I've been trained in it through 4 different systems. But basically, you have an open and curious conversation with the part of you that's kicking you in the ass. And eventually, if you develop a good rapport, you can ask if it would be open to a job change. So when I got to that place with my inner critic, I said, okay, I get how valuable you are. And our parts need praise too, just like us. So I'm like, I get how valuable you are. I get that you want good from me, but the way that you're going about it right now isn't working for me. Would you be open to a job change? And my critic said yes. And what we came up with was that it would leave me alone while I write the initial draft. And then I invite it to come in and help me edit, because your inner critic makes a great editor. It's dispassionate. It's not married to the work. It doesn't care about your fifis, as I like, it doesn't care about your feelings, as I called my fifis. And so I invite my inner critic to come in and help me edit. And after that, I was able to generate much better work and not fail out of grad school. So how this works, I'm thinking of a client who was in a high conflict divorce kind of situation, and her critic, she had actually embodied the voice of her ex-husband that was incredibly critical and belittling. As we do, we start to hear their voice in our head. And so anything she did well, she would undercut. And so I worked with her directly and with that voice for her to be able to create distance between, oh, that's his voice that I've internalized. And part of how I had her do it was force is not the right word, but I invited her to really acknowledge when she did something well and sit in the discomfort of that. Sit in the discomfort of the very next thought that was usually something like, you're so privileged, blah, 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 or whatever the ugly thought was, to just let that thought be over here and not take it on. And sit in the discomfort of owning, oh, you know what? I handled that conversation well. I didn't lose my ground. I stayed clear there. And I worked with her from before leaving him through 5 years after. We worked together for a long time. And she still hears that voice, but now she's able to be in a conversation with him and not crumble. And she's able to hold her own, and not in a defensive, attacking way, but just a backbone way. And she started doing other incredible stuff in her life. And yes, that critic is still there. And this is what I want to say. The critic is going to be there. So you might as well just make friends with it, recognize it's trying to do something positive for you. This is true of self-loathing. This is true of all the things that are difficult, guilt, any of the things that are hard for us to bear. It's trying to do its best for you. It just has a messed up way of doing it that doesn't work well. And if you can hold that and stay curious, you can set that voice to the side. So it's like, oh, hi, I see you. Hi, critic. I hear you. I see you. Thank you. That's not what we're doing right now. I'm doing this. But you can't really do that move until you've made friends with it. Otherwise, it's just going to get louder.
Yeah, so I'm just going to reflect back with the inner wisdom,
Please.
the wisdom zone. What I'm hearing is step 1 is we got to slow things down. We got to slow down. We got to tap in and tune in. And then there was a permission piece there. And
permission for all of us to exist.
For all of my parts to exist, right? So let me not hate on a piece of myself. And then in doing so, that invitation to tune into intuition, which all of the wisdom zone work requires that you're doing some work on your inner critic prior so that you actually can tune in, is what I'm hearing. And then once you tune into the intuition, now it's like flow marries wisdom zone because you've got both going on. And my sense is, because I know there are people, there's a listener out there who's going, that's a whole neighborhood I don't know a whole lot about.
That's way too complicated for me.
And I think that brings us back to something you said a few minutes ago, which is the practice of meditation. And so could you just wrap this all in a bow by talking about the value of what meditation does that plays into all of these and brings it together?
Happily. So I think there's a lot of misconception out there about meditation, that it's somehow about stopping our thoughts and having a totally empty mind. And as someone with a really hefty intellect and an incredible mind, I'm here to, and an over 40 years meditation practice, I'm here to tell you that shit doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Every now and then, maybe once in a blue moon, there might be a quiet time. But what meditation teaches us to do, and there are many different kinds of meditation, but what I'm talking about is just sitting. So I'm not talking about where we listen to pretty music and we're guided. And those are great too. Like when it's like different remedies for different situations. So if you're in your nervous system is activated and you're highly stressed out, just sitting is not the thing. You want to just get a beautiful piece of music and listen to that and let the music, especially if it's the beats are tuned to a particular frequency that brings your nervous system down. There's binaural beats. There's all sorts of fancy stuff out there that is very helpful to downregulate your system. So that's one type of thing that you could call meditation, and that's really applicable when you're activated. What I'm talking about is the kind of sitting meditation where you just sit quietly and be with your breath and watch the clouds go by, and the clouds are your thoughts. And the practice is not to catch onto any of them. The practice is not to have a thought and then go down that path till 20 minutes have gone by and you're like, oh my God, I've just been thinking about this thing my mother said to me when I was 3 for the last 20 minutes. That's, you catch that, oh, I'm going down that path, and you just come back and you just sit quiet. What that does, what that teaches you, is to have a little bit of space. That slowing down that I talk about is to have a little bit, it creates a gap between the thought and your reaction to the thought, which in high conflict situations is an essential skill. You want to have a gap between a thought and what comes out of your mouth next. Because there's the first thing that comes up in response to the thought, the kill or be killed thing that comes up in response to the thought. And then it's like, oh, hi, there you are. And when you have a gap, you can pause for a second and you can choose a more effective response. That's what meditation gives you, is the ability to be present enough that you hear the thoughts happening as they're happening, and you build a gap between the thought and what you do with that thought.
You know, I wrote a poem a number of years back, and I talked about the wild stallion in my mind and how with every thought was a wild stallion, and I would just jump my ass on the back of it and we would go riding off into my emotional upset. And
yes,
and the idea was, let the stallion go. Notice the stallion, the thought, let the stallion go and just breathe. Don't emotionally attach to it. And what's fascinating, and I've been meditating on and off since the early stages of my divorce, where I absolutely needed to. It was the only thing that would keep me sane. And, you know, and it's so fascinating because you could be sitting there and then your 3 minutes are up or your 5 minutes are up. And I always recommend start tiny.
yes,
And
agreed.
you're like, I failed because the first thought came, I jumped on the back of it and I ran off and my 3 minutes were up and I was just ruminating for 3 minutes. And yet that's still okay, isn't it? Isn't it okay? Because it's actually part of the process.
It's totally part of the process. And through being compassionate with yourself in that spot, like you're not sticking your head in the sand. You're like, wow, I spent these 3 minutes ruminating. That's what actually happened. And that's okay. That's part of the process. And so you learn simultaneously as you learn to disengage from your thoughts in this way and build a gap, you're also training yourself in self-compassion, which I think when you're going through high conflict situations is key to have. Because if you can't be compassionate for yourself on your good days and your bad days, like some days are going to suck and some days you're going to react in ways you're embarrassed about. And can you be compassionate with yourself there? That's where the rubber meets the road. And that's what meditation begins to build as a muscle, is a kind of self-kindness and a self-compassion that you're going to need to get through all the stages of this divorce and to build your next stage of your life. Self-compassion is the key.
So as we begin to wrap up here, we've got struggle, release, flow, recovery. We've got with the wisdom zone where we slow down, we give all of our pieces and parts permission to be themselves. We quiet that inner critic, we tap into our intuition. And through this whole thing, all of these practices, what I'm hearing is it brings you to a greater level of mindfulness and with more access to the depth of wisdom that you have in your subconscious.
I just thought of a great analogy that's going to tie this all together.
Go for it, girlfriend.
It's like having a bunch of kids in the car. So all the parts of you who are chiming in and yammering, and one of them's having a tantrum and one of them's slumped over in the corner sad and all the things, those are like a bunch of kids in the car, and you don't want any of them driving the car. Who you want taking the wheel is your adult, or what's also called your aware ego. And the aware ego is, and I would call this your wisdom zone. That part of you sees the whole picture. It sees the kid having the tantrum and the one over there sad, and it sees all the kids in the car, but it's not subject to them. Like it sees them. It's what I was just talking about with meditation. It's dispassionate. There's the tantrum. There's the this. Okay, they're all allowed to exist. I'm taking the wheel. Yes. And you want your adult aware ego to be the one who's driving the car, who's making the decisions, who's having the conversations, who's making the choices to set up the rest of your life. And the way that you gain more access to that wide seeing, both wise and wide seeing part of you, is all the things you just said: slowing down, permission for everyone to exist, mindfulness, self-compassion, I would add, self-acceptance, and really prioritizing yourself.
Well done. Beautiful. Marie Elizabeth, this has been fascinating. I love the structure. I'm a structure girl. I definitely love the structure. And I know that you have a gift for our audience. And I also want you to take a moment to just share with the listener where they can find you so that they can learn more about your services.
Thank you. So you can find me at marieelizabethmali.com, and also on social media, it's also that. So Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook page, it's all Marie Elizabeth, TikTok, YouTube, it's all marieelizabethmali.com. Specifically around relationships, you can find my Relationship Alchemy podcast on my YouTube channel. It's one of the playlists. I know I'm no longer adding new episodes, but there's lots of useful resources there around communication and different aspects of relating that people might find useful in different stages of relationship. And the free gift that I have today, sorry guys, it's for the women, but it's called the Wise Woman Power Quiz. And it gives you what I call your passion body archetype. So an aspect of the wisdom zone is I call activating the passion body. We're not going to get into that right now, but when you go to marieelizabethmolly.com/wise-women-power-quiz,
And it's in the show notes.
it'll be in the show notes. You get entered into a 7-day series that really breaks down these different archetypes, and you get to see what your strengths are, what typically is challenging for you, what you need to focus on. There's a private podcast included with that. And that's a really great way to start accessing more of this deeper wisdom. And for the guys, what I would suggest, if the way I'm talking and working is interesting to you, reach out to me and let's have a conversation, because I do work privately with folks of all genders. It's just all my group work and my retreats in Mexico are with women, but I do work privately with folks of all genders.
Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing. I love the work that you do. I love your whole paradigm that you shared with us. And I am going to personally commit to keeping an eye on my flow and trying to tamp down my force. That would serve me very well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, maybe have a conversation with it. Like, hey, what are you scared of? What are you trying to achieve? How can we work better together? Maybe that's the next step, is to have a conversation with your driver.
There you go. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. I'll let you know how it goes.
I know. I want to hear. I have a hefty driver too, so I feel for you. And there's times where it's just out of control, and I get it, and then I just have to be like, oh, hi. Yeah, I get it. You're out of control. Okay, I'm just going to sit this out. I'm going to wait this out. And then eventually something shifts it.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review, subscribe so that you get them all in your feed. And I will be back again real soon with another episode. Until then, you take care.